Welcome to Detective Tales, where mysteries unfold and every detail matters. Inspired by the timeless works of Agatha Christie, this channel brings you classic-style detective stories filled with suspense, hidden motives, and unexpected revelations. Here, you'll walk alongside brilliant minds like Hercule Poirot and Miss Marple, unraveling puzzles where nothing is quite as it seems. Prepare yourself for intrigue, atmosphere, and a journey into the golden age of detective fiction. The case begins now.
Miss Marple and the Bloomsbury Brompton Mystery, Chapter 1. An Urgent Summons. On a crisp spring morning in St. Mary Mead, Miss Jane Marple sat at her dining table, contentedly trimming an unruly tendril from her African violet. She had just poured her customary cup of tea when the letter arrived, a neat envelope bearing the return address of Mrs. Mildred Brompton in Bloomsbury. This was not entirely unexpected, for Mildred Brompton was a London hostess Miss Marple had met at numerous gatherings. Yet the letter within was far from ordinary in tone. "My dear Jane, I fear something dreadful is about to happen. I beg you, come to Bloomsbury at once. I trust only you. Monsieur Brompton." Miss Marple's heart fluttered. Though she was quite used to the everyday intrigues of village life, missing brooches, petty quarrels, whispered scandals, this had the ring of genuine alarm. Its brevity and urgency suggested that whatever danger Mildred feared was both serious and imminent. Sliding the note back into its envelope, Miss Marple realized she had no choice but to travel to London without delay. She believed in her friend's sincerity. In her experience, such pleas were never made lightly. By noon, Miss Marple was seated on the train to Paddington, the familiar countryside slipping past. Though she busied herself with knitting, an especially comforting pastime, her mind churned with questions. What trouble could Mildred Brompton be in? Had something in her London circles sparked a crisis, or a threat that only an outsider, someone discreet and astute, could handle? Arriving in bustling Paddington Station, Miss Marple navigated the crowd with measured calm. Taxis rattled along busy streets, carrying her to Bloomsbury, where Georgian townhouses stood in dignified rows. At last, she alighted before Mildred's address. She expected, or at least hoped, to see a flustered but relieved Mrs. Brompton waiting at the door. Instead, the windows were shuttered and no one emerged to greet her. She tried the bell, then tapped discreetly on the wooden door. Silence. A neighbour with a shopping basket paused, curiosity piqued by Miss Marple's obvious concern. "She left last night, poor dear," the neighbour said, lowering her voice. "Seemed terribly upset, got into a waiting taxi and never came back." Miss Marple thanked her politely. As she hesitated on the pavement, uncertain of Mildred's whereabouts, she recalled the small key that Mrs. Brompton had once insisted she keep for emergencies. Opening her handbag, Miss Marple found the key precisely where she had tucked it away for safekeeping. With a twinge of misgiving, she unlocked the front door and slipped into the house. Inside, the hallway was dim, the faint scent of stale air lingering. Nothing looked obviously disturbed at first. There was a neat umbrella stand, a mirror reflecting Miss Marple's concerned expression. Nonetheless, an intangible feeling of unease pressed upon her. She set down her travelling bag and switched on a small lamp. In the sitting room, she observed the remains of a tea tray, cups left unwashed, a teapot stone cold. One chair was pushed away from the table as though someone had bolted up in haste. A sense of foreboding guided her up the narrow staircase, each step seeming to echo ominously. At the landing, she detected a faint, bitter-sweet odour. Following that unsettling scent, she peeked into a modest sitting room. There, on the Persian rug, lay a man's body, face ashen, eyes staring blankly. Miss Marple drew in a sharp breath, dismay and pity mingling in her breast. Who was he? Why had he died in Mildred Brompton's house? And, most pressing of all, what had become of Mildred herself? Summoning her composure, Miss Marple descended to the telephone in the hallway. Though deeply shocked, she would do what must be done, call the police, report what she had found, and quietly begin to unravel the dangerous events that had led to this tragic discovery. Chapter 2. An Unfortunate Discovery. The police arrived swiftly after Miss Marple's call, their brisk footsteps echoing across the tiled floor of Mrs. Brompton's hallway. A uniformed constable appeared first, looking rather pale when Miss Marple guided him upstairs to the small sitting-room. He paused in the doorway, inhaling sharply at the sight of the man's lifeless form upon the rug. Not long after, Detective Inspector John Brant arrived, tall and lean, with keen eyes that betrayed years of service spent confronting tragedy and deceit. He offered Miss Marple a nod of professional courtesy before stepping into the room to examine the body. While he crouched to inspect the victim's hands and collar, Miss Marple stood quietly in the corridor, her calm demeanour masking her underlying concern for Mildred Brompton. Downstairs, subdued voices in the parlour signalled the start of a methodical search. A second constable took Miss Marple's statement, scribbling in a small notebook. She explained how she had come at Mrs. Brompton's urgent invitation, found the house locked, and used the spare key that Mildred had once entrusted to her. She recounted the unnerving discovery of the dead man and her immediate call to the authorities. The constable's face grew increasingly solemn as she spoke. "I've known Mrs. Brompton for some years," Miss Marple concluded softly. "She's a friend, rather timid, perhaps, but not the sort to vanish without reason. Her letter spoke of something dreadful. I'm afraid we see a manifestation of that dread upstairs." Meanwhile, Inspector Brant completed his initial examination and joined them on the landing. "We have identified the deceased as Mr. Lionel Marsh, a historian, at King's College, London," he said, consulting some documents the victim had carried. "Early signs point to strangulation, though we'll await the pathologist's final report." He paused, regarding Miss Marple with neither suspicion nor condescension, but with the composed curiosity of a man who suspected she might be more observant than most. "And you have no idea how Mr. Marsh came to be here, Miss Marple?" "None at all," she replied quietly. "I can only speculate that he and Mrs. Brompton must have arranged some meeting, perhaps connected to his research. Mildred Brompton did take an interest in historical matters, but I never imagined she was entangled in anything dangerous." While they spoke, a faint bustle emanated from outside. The neighbours, drawn by the sight of a police car, had begun to gather on the pavement. Miss Marple glimpsed them through the window. A few curious faces pressed against the iron railings, eager for a glimpse of drama. Memories of village gossip in St. Mary Mead reminded her how swiftly stories could spiral, and how rumours sometimes obscured the truth rather than illuminate it. Inspector Brant seemed of a similar mind. "We'll have to interview the neighbours, ascertain if anyone saw or heard anything overnight," he said. "As for Mrs. Brompton's whereabouts, we shall treaty with him. Dunno who, but she seemed nervous." He tapped his foot on a threadbare rug. They pulled that rug aside, found a trapdoor underneath. Inspector Brant lifted the rug, revealing a square trapdoor in the boards. He gripped the iron ring, tugging until it screeched open, revealing a dark space below. Musty air wafted up. "Stay behind me," he instructed, descending cautiously with his torch. Miss Marple, refusing to be left behind, followed carefully, her heart quickening. Wooden steps creaked underfoot, leading to a cramped cellar. By the torch's narrow beam she spotted bricks half crumbling with damp. Shelves lined one wall containing old ledgers and dusty crates. In the corner, a small table stood with an overturned chair. Papers were strewn across the table, and a single candle stub melted onto its surface. Inspector Brant knelt, gathering the pages. Some were heavily annotated copies of the Brompton family tree, names circled, scribbled notes in the margins. Miss Marple's gaze fell on a separate sheet containing new genealogical references, tied neatly with twine. One phrase jumped out: rightful heir to Brompton Estate, 1792 Covenant. The writing was Lionel Marsh's, that same looping style Miss Marple had seen in his diaries. Her heart fluttered with excitement. If this documented a rightful heir that had been overlooked or deliberately erased, then it could mean a substantial claim that threatened someone else's position. Indeed, it seemed to confirm Marsh's suspicions. A living descendant existed who possessed a legitimate, if hidden, right to Brompton property or wealth. Suddenly, Mr. Hawkins, standing near a damp corner, yelped in alarm. Miss Marple turned to see him tugging at a loop of rope trailing along the cellar floor. He stumbled backwards, stirring loose debris and revealing a battered valise partly concealed in the shadows. Inspector Brant pulled it out, forcing the rusted clasps open. Inside lay more documents, but also something that made Miss Marple catch her breath: a slim ledger with the Brompton seal embossed in gold. The edges of the pages were stained, as if someone had tried to destroy it with water or chemicals, but the text still appeared legible. Before they could examine the ledger further, the sound of footsteps echoed from above, the swift, purposeful stride of someone who did not wish to be discovered. Inspector Brant snapped off his torch, gesturing for silence. Miss Marple stood very still, heart pounding. Whoever lurked in Chetwynd House might well be the killer, determined to silence the truth forever. And now, faced with these damning records, that threat was more urgent than ever. Chapter 8. The Final Revelation. Silence reigned in the underground cellar at Chetwynd House, broken only by the thud of those mysterious footsteps overhead. Inspector Brant motioned for caution, switching off his torch so no betraying light would filter through the cracks in the boards. Miss Marple, heart racing, clutched the recovered ledger that bore the Brompton seal. Within its fragile pages might lie the final key to Mr. Lionel Marsh's murder, and the motive behind Mrs. Brompton's disappearance. Moments later, the footsteps receded down the corridor. Inspector Brant nudged open the trap-door, carefully peering out. With no one in sight, they climbed back into the library, the caretaker, Mr. Hawkins, trembling behind them. Over their heads, dust motes drifted in the daylight, streaming through cracked windows. A door slammed somewhere in the mansion. Whoever had been there was gone. "Let's examine these documents," the inspector murmured. "We've no time to lose." They made their way to a massive, long-disused desk in a corner of the library. Miss Marple gently opened the battered ledger. Its title page identified it as an 18th-century record of the Brompton lineage, something once kept private, judging by the repeated attempts to destroy or hide it. Handwritten names wove across the pages, branches of a family tree leading to a quiet footnote. That footnote revealed an overlooked or illegitimate heir whose descendants had been all but erased from public record. "Well, well," Inspector Brant breathed, scanning the spidery script. "So there is another Brompton line, one that never received recognition. And here," he traced a final scrawling entry, "is the modern name attached to it." Miss Marple read it, eyes widening. "Henry Gresham," she whispered. The name was plain. The genealogical notes, cross-referenced with Lionel Marsh's scrawls in the margin, made it unmistakable. Gresham was the living heir to a fortune he'd never publicly claimed. He must have learned about his ancestry and feared others would discover it first, or challenge him if the estate was ever lawfully settled, she said. Inspector Brant nodded gravely. Which means Marsh's investigation threatened to ruin Gresham's chance at a secret windfall. He was the one with motive enough to kill. Their conclusion was confirmed when they emerged from Chetwynd House and found Henry Gresham himself lingering by the rusted gate, eyes flicking nervously towards the mansion. Upon seeing them, he made a desperate attempt to slip away. But a quick command from Inspector Brant brought constables out of hiding. Brant had planned for the possibility that the culprit might return. Cornered, Gresham's composure cracked. He stammered, "I only sought justice. That estate should be mine by right. Lionel Marsh discovered my claim, threatened to publish it, and the Brompton assets would go into probate. Endless legal wrangling. I would have got a pittance at best, or been forced to share with them." His face contorted. "I confronted him. He refused to yield, so I—" "So you strangled him," Miss Marple said quietly, voice tinged with sadness, "and then took Mrs. Brompton captive, hoping to force her to relinquish or destroy any further evidence, but she escaped, or you let her go in a moment of panic." Gresham's anger flared. "She was meddling too. She insisted on revealing everything to the authorities. I lost my temper." Constables led him away, and as his accusations and pleas faded, Inspector Brant turned to Miss Marple. "We've found Mrs. Brompton safe," he said gently. "A frightened traveller helped her reach the nearest station after she escaped Gresham. She's shaken but otherwise unharmed." Relief flooded Miss Marple's features. She clutched the ledger that had cost Lionel Marsh his life and nearly cost Mrs. Brompton hers. Another dark secret once hidden in dusty pages had found its way into the light, reminding her again that the past, no matter how carefully buried, has a way of reaching into the present. Inspector Brant watched the constables escort Gresham to the waiting car, then offered Miss Marple a wry smile. "Thank you," he said. "Without your tenacity, we might still be fumbling in the dark." Miss Marple, modest as ever, only shook her head. "I simply paid attention to the small details, Inspector, as one must, especially when the truth, like a forgotten heir, lurks in the unlikeliest of places. Professed eagerness to help could also be hiding their own fears or complicities." Soon she left Lennox to his tea, stepping back onto the pavement, with her mind racing. By the day's end, she had assembled a fuller portrait of Lionel Marsh's obsession: genealogies, diaries, a Pandora's box of Brompton family secrets. Dorothea Marsh's grief, Annabel Swift's alarm, and Mildred Brompton's abrupt disappearance all pivoted around these elusive revelations. At every turn lay the same question: what truth could be so dire as to spark murder? Miss Marple could only hope that if she uncovered the answer quickly enough, she might save an innocent life and keep the killer from striking again. Chapter 6. Shadows of Deception. A grey twilight settled over Bloomsbury, drifting through the tall windows of Mrs. Brompton's townhouse and casting elongated shadows across the corridor. Inspector Brant had just departed to compare notes with his team, leaving Miss Marple momentarily alone in the front parlour. She listened to his fading footsteps on the pavement outside, then turned her attention to the clutter of documents and diaries on the table. The next moment, a timid knock alerted her to the presence of Annabel Swift, standing in the doorway with a hesitant air. She carried a slim ledger bound in faded green cloth. I found this in one of Mrs. Brompton's dressing-table drawers," she said, edging forward. "It didn't look like her usual accounts. I wasn't sure what to do, so I brought it here." Gently, Miss Marple opened the ledger. The pages revealed meticulous entries, lists of names, dates, and occasional notations in a flowing script. Most intriguing were references to Chetwynd House, an estate apparently abandoned decades ago. Miss Marple recalled Lionel Marsh's diaries mentioning that name. Could these entries hint at some ancestral property belonging to the Bromptons? If so, why would Mrs. Brompton keep such records hidden, especially while assisting Marsh's research? Before Miss Marple could delve deeper, Annabel stiffened, eyes widening. She whispered, "Footsteps in the hall?" Sure enough, they heard the boards creak. A moment later, Professor Lennox appeared at the threshold, looking abashed. "My apologies," he said. "Inspector Brandt asked me to review certain diaries we found upstairs. I didn't realize you had company." He offered a polite nod to Annabel before turning his attention to the ledger in Miss Marple's hands. "Is that another find?" he asked, sounding curious yet cautious. When Miss Marple nodded, he frowned. "I've never seen this particular ledger before. It may contain precisely the genealogical details Lionel sought." Annabel clasped her hands. "I only wish Mrs. Brompton had confided in me. She seemed to fear something buried in the past." After exchanging a few tentative remarks, Lennox excused himself to the upstairs study, leaving Miss Marple alone again with Annabel. The young woman lingered, eyeing the ledger as though it were a Pandora's box. Miss Marple placed a reassuring hand on her arm. "Take courage, my dear," she said kindly. "We'll see the truth revealed soon enough." When at last Annabel departed, Miss Marple decided to examine the ledger in earnest. Several pages, though neatly written, were heavily annotated in Lionel Marsh's hand, complete with question marks and exclamation marks. She traced a single note he had scrawled in the margin. "If proven, potential claimant stands to upend entire Brompton estate." A potential claimant, someone who stood to challenge existing heirs. Miss Marple recalled the references to an 18th-century inheritance scandal. Could it be that Marsh had identified a living descendant with a legitimate right to the Brompton estate? If so, it meant that someone else, perhaps the current beneficiary, had reason to fear exposure. Her thoughts were interrupted by the rumble of the front door. Inspector Brandt returned, accompanied by the caretaker of a property outside London. The man wore a battered cap and twisted it nervously in his hands. "I mind a place called Chetwynd House," he explained. "Been empty a long while, but not so empty of late. A fortnight ago I saw a gent snooping around matching Mr. Marsh's description. He was with a lady, too. I never knew they was in danger." As he spoke, Miss Marple felt an odd chill. Here, then, was a tangible thread connecting Lionel Marsh, a secret ledger, and a derelict estate. Might that estate hold the final piece of this puzzle, and perhaps even the missing Mrs. Brompton? The caretaker had more to share, but Miss Marple saw he was clearly uneasy, glancing from side to side as if afraid of being overheard. Quietly, she retrieved her coat. If Chetwynd House was indeed the seat of these elusive secrets, a visit would be the logical next step. Time, she sensed, was slipping away. Somewhere behind the facade of genealogical records, clandestine visits, and anxious whispers, a killer remained at large, and Miss Marple feared that the killer might be poised to strike again if truth threatened to emerge too soon. Chapter 7. Secrets at Chetwynd House. The following morning dawned grey and ominous, as if nature itself sensed the looming revelations. Miss Marple, Inspector Brandt, and the uneasy caretaker, Mr. Hawkins, set out for Chetwynd House in a small motor-car. The caretaker had agreed to guide them, albeit with reluctance, muttering his misgivings about old houses that don't like to be stirred. Undeterred, Miss Marple sat composed in the back seat, her keen blue eyes observing the changing scenery as London's bustle fell away into quieter outskirts. They arrived at a tall, rusted gate, flanked by briars and ivy, the path beyond choked with weeds. A worn sign read, "Chetwynd House, private, although its grandeur had long since faded. Mr. Hawkins wrestled with the padlock until it gave, with a screech, then led them up the gravel drive which crunched beneath their feet in the hush of mid-morning. The mansion itself loomed before them, windows shuttered or broken, its stone facade streaked by decades of neglect. "This way," said Mr. Hawkins, gesturing with his cap. "The front entrance sticks, but the side door's easier." Indeed, the main oak doors stood obstinately jammed. They circled round the side, pushing through an overgrown courtyard to reach a smaller door, half-rotted. Inspector Brant tested it, and it yielded with a groan. Within, dust motes swirled in stagnant air, the faint odour of damp lingering in the corridors. Mr. Hawkins led them past a warren of empty rooms, once parlours or studies, now bearing only tattered drapes and overturned chairs. Eventually, they reached a cavernous library. The caretaker raised his lantern, revealing walls lined with mouldering shelves, many empty. A battered wooden ladder lay toppled on the floor. "It was here I saw that man who looked like the picture you showed me of Mr. Marsh," Hawkins murmured. He poked round these shelves, and there was a lady. I was stunned to learn of his death. With the inspector's permission, they moved inside to discuss Professor Lennox's insights. Seated in the parlour, Lennox dabbed nervously at his brow with a handkerchief. Lionel believed he was on to something momentous. He spoke of certain 18th-century diaries referencing a Bloomsbury family legacy, though he never named them outright. Now I see it must have been the Bromptons. He said he found a link that would cause a stir, if made public. Inspector Brant glanced at Miss Marple, who offered him a slight nod. "We've heard similar suggestions," she said, recalling the conversation with Lionel's widow. "Do you believe his discovery could justify murder?" Lennox grimaced. "I find that difficult to believe, yet if sensitive reputations or fortunes were at stake—" He let the thought trail off, then sighed. "I can only say that Lionel was not a man to keep quiet if he felt the truth should be known." Before they could delve deeper, a flurry of activity in the hallway drew their attention. A constable stepped in, looking mildly flustered. "Inspector, a young lady's arrived, says she's Miss Annabel Swift, Mrs. Brompton's companion. She's rather distressed." Miss Marple rose at once, remembering Mildred had once mentioned an assistant named Annabel who helped sort through family papers. The group followed the constable to the dining room, where a pale young woman stood wringing her hands. Her worried gaze swept between Miss Marple and Inspector Brant. "I've been away visiting relatives," she began, voice trembling. "When I returned, I heard about Mr. Marsh and that Mrs. Brompton was missing. I don't understand any of this." Inspector Brant encouraged Annabel to sit. Miss Marple, taking a seat beside her, asked in gentle tones if the young companion had noticed anything unusual before her trip. Annabel hesitated, biting her lip. Mrs. Brompton was troubled about some letters Mr. Marsh had shown her, old correspondences, diaries. "They concerned the Brompton family lineage," she said, "and might be important." She grew frightened, though she wouldn't tell me why. All she said was that danger often hides behind the facade of respectability. This vague but unsettling remark piqued Miss Marple's interest. Perhaps Mrs. Brompton, a mild-tempered hostess, had discovered something truly sinister lurking in her ancestry, something Marsh intended to expose. If so, had a desperate third party, determined to maintain silence, struck first. A hush fell over the room as Annabel dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief. "Mrs. Brompton warned me not to mention any of this to outsiders," she added. "But now I'm scared she's in real danger. I don't know how else to help." Miss Marple laid a comforting hand on Annabel's arm, her mind buzzing with fresh possibilities. Professor Lennox's account of Marsh's momentous discovery, Dorothea Marsh's uneasy reticence, and now Annabel Swift's disclosure of a frightened mistress all pointed to a secret with the repercussions profound enough to prompt violence. The net of suspicion seemed to widen with every hour, ensnaring those who knew too much. Whether the catalyst lay in 18th-century diaries or more modern ambitions, Miss Marple felt sure of one thing: the past was reaching its spectral hand into the present, and no one would be safe until its mystery was finally laid bare. Chapter 5. A Tangle of History. A restless night found Miss Marple awake before dawn, poring over every detail gleaned thus far. The faint glow of an early London sunrise revealed how little she truly understood, yet experience had taught her that patience and steady observation could tease out even the most elusive of secrets. After breakfast, she decided to make her way to the British Museum to learn more of Mr. Lionel Marsh's recent pursuits, and to see if his colleagues there might recall any significant clues. Stepping into the grand, hushed reading room, she felt a comforting sense of order. Rows of tables stood beneath soaring ceilings, while librarians bustled softly. She had arranged to meet a certain Mr. Penrose, an archivist who had once worked alongside Mr. Marsh. His slight stoop and habitually narrowed eyes spoke of long hours examining dusty folios, yet his smile upon greeting Miss Marple was kindly. They sat at a table piled with ledgers and parchment boxes, each labelled in precise handwriting. "I knew Lionel Marsh well in a professional sense," said Mr. Penrose, polishing his spectacles. "He had an enthusiasm for family records, an enthusiasm that, I fear, may have carried him too far. He confided in me that his recent discovery related to the Brompton line. A real Pandora's box of secrets, he called it." Mr. Penrose set aside a leather-bound volume and lowered his voice. He also implied certain powerful individuals would prefer old scandals remain buried, royal ties, noble families, one never knows whose footsteps might be disturbed by genealogical digging. But I must stress, Miss Marple, that I only overheard whispers. Lionel kept the details under tight wraps, and I never pried. After thanking him, Miss Marple spent some time leafing through the reference volumes Marsh had consulted. Many dealt with 18th-century legal disputes, inheritance claims, and personal diaries. Nothing in the texts outright declared scandal, yet the marginal notes hinted at paternal lineages quietly contested or properties sold under murky circumstances. It was the kind of research that, if connected to living heirs, might prove devastating. Leaving Mr. Penrose's gentle realm of order, Miss Marple stepped back into the lively streets. Traffic bustled, and the day's newsboys shouted headlines that seemed trivial in comparison to the hushed drama she was investigating. She reflected on what she'd learned. If Lionel Marsh had indeed uncovered a hidden family scandal involving the Bromptons, it could jeopardize reputations or fortunes, providing a motive for violence. All roads so far led back to these secret genealogical records. On the way home, she stopped at a small tea-room and found, much to her surprise, Professor Hugh Lennox seated alone. He beckoned her over politely. "I hoped I might speak with you further," he admitted once she sat down. "I can't shake the sense that I've failed my friend. Lionel was passionate, yes, even reckless, but a good man. If only I'd known the seriousness of his predicament sooner." Miss Marple listened, sympathy tinged with caution. "You believe someone close to this inheritance, or its exposure, was desperate enough for murder?" Lennox pressed his lips together. "Marsh believed so. He told me one evening, 'Hugh, if this name comes to light, someone stands to lose everything.' I thought he was exaggerating. Now I see I was naive." He paused, then lowered his voice. "Look, if I can be of service, Please don't hesitate. I want justice for Lionel." Though Miss Marple nodded gratefully, she maintained her reserve. In her experience, those who her as missing, possibly a victim, though it's too soon to be certain. His tone was kindly, but tinged with caution. "For now, Miss Marple, I'd like you to remain in London. We may need to question you further." Miss Marple gave a small nod. She was not one to obstruct a formal investigation, yet she knew from experience that an older woman with a knack for noticing small details could prove invaluable. She resolved, silently, that she would do what she could to find her friend. In the hush that followed, the weight of Mr. Lionel Marsh's untimely death seemed to press upon them all. Someone, somewhere, had strangled a historian in Mildred Brompton's home, and the motive for such a crime was as elusive as the missing hostess herself. With the afternoon light waning, Inspector Brant sent for more officers to comb through the house, while Miss Marple gazed around the sombre hallway, heart heavy with foreboding. Where was Mildred Brompton? And what dark secret had brought Lionel Marsh to such a fatal end? Chapter 3. Threads of Suspicion. Morning broke over Bloomsbury with an unseasonable chill. A light fog clung to the street outside Mrs. Brompton's townhouse, softening the outline of the railings and the row of elegant facades. Inside, however, the atmosphere was far from tranquil. Detective Inspector Brant had assigned a small team to examine every inch of the property. Footsteps echoed on the hardwood floors, cupboards and drawers clicked open and shut, while cameras flashed upstairs to document the scene of the crime. The bustling activity seemed incongruous against the home's usual refinement. Miss Marple, having stayed overnight in a modest hotel nearby, arrived early at the inspector's summons. Stepping into the parlour, she noticed that the tea service had been cleared away and the furniture rearranged to accommodate a makeshift workstation. Papers lay spread on a low table, including a photograph of the victim, Mr. Lionel Marsh, and the initial police sketches of the room in which he was found. Inspector Brant stood by the mantel, reviewing notes in a brisk, efficient manner. Yet when he greeted Miss Marple, there was a hint of warmth in his voice. "Thank you for returning promptly," he said. "We have a few more questions, if you wouldn't mind." "Not at all," Miss Marple replied kindly. "I do hope there's some sign of Mrs. Brompton." Brant shook his head. "I'm afraid not. We've circulated her description to every station in London, but thus far, no reliable sightings." After a brief pause, he continued, "The neighbours remain quite talkative, though. A Mrs. Penrose reported overhearing what she called raised voices at this house last week. One male, one female. She couldn't identify them, but the argument lasted some minutes. Another neighbour thought she saw Mr. Marsh come by twice in the past month, always late in the evening." Miss Marple listened attentively. "That might suggest a clandestine arrangement, perhaps some research matter too delicate for normal hours, or possibly something more personal." Brant nodded, turning to rifle through a folder. "We've also discovered a letter Mr. Marsh wrote to a colleague at King's College. It mentions working on a sensitive project related to a prominent Bloomsbury family. It could tie back to Mrs. Brompton, her late husband's family connections, or something along those lines. We're still investigating." Curiosity piqued, Miss Marple cast her gaze about the parlour, recalling the tidy decor she'd glimpsed on her arrival. Now it bore the marks of investigation. Chairs moved for fingerprint dusting, a rug folded back to check for stains, a handful of old newspapers stacked by the hearth. She noticed one in particular was dated nearly a decade earlier. As she gently lifted it, she spotted a short article, circled in ink. "Local historian discovers rare manuscript." It referred to Lionel Marsh by name, praising his work on genealogical records. Had that old accomplishment led him somehow to a more perilous inquiry? Before she could dwell on the connection, the parlour door opened to admit a small, well-dressed woman with greying hair and an air of quiet dignity. She introduced herself as Mrs. Dorothea Marsh, Lionel's widow. Her composure was remarkable, though tension flashed in her eyes as they fell upon the photo of her late husband. Inspector Brant invited her to sit, offering hushed condolences. Miss Marple, mindful of courtesy, placed the newspaper aside and listened closely. Yes, Lionel dedicated most of his life to research, Dorothea said, her voice subdued. He believed certain family lines held hidden truths worth uncovering. Our marriage— She hesitated. Let us say we lived more like polite acquaintances toward the end than husband and wife. I never dreamt it would end so horribly. When the inspector probed about Mrs. Brompton, Dorothea glanced away. I know very little about her, truly. He did mention she possessed ledgers or diaries relevant to his studies, but that is all. Please, if I had known what danger Lionel was in, I'd have stopped him somehow. Her words, tinged with regret, hung in the silence. Miss Marple studied the widow's composure. Experience had taught her that grief took many forms and guilt was sometimes hidden beneath carefully chosen phrases. Yet, if Dorothea spoke truly, she might be another unwitting victim of Lionel Marsh's secret research. As the interview concluded, Inspector Brant escorted Mrs. Marsh to another room for further details, leaving Miss Marple in reflective solitude. The tangible sorrow in Mrs. Marsh's demeanour, the pointed references to hidden truths, and the lingering question of Mildred Brompton's fate all wove a tapestry of suspicion that seemed ever more tangled. Though morning light now flooded the parlour, the undercurrents of this mystery remained in shadow, and Miss Marple, quietly determined, resolved to keep searching until she could cast proper light on them all. Chapter 4. A Web of Clues. The following morning Miss Marple rose early, her thoughts still on the perplexing circumstances surrounding Mr. Lionel Marsh's demise and Mrs. Brompton's disappearance. Though the police investigation continued apace, she sensed the case demanded a subtler scrutiny. After all, if there were secrets buried in centuries-old diaries or genealogical records, their significance might elude even the most diligent constable unless they knew precisely what to look for. She arrived at the Brompton townhouse to find Inspector Brant on the doorstep, speaking with a man of scholarly appearance, tall and lean, with a neat grey moustache. Upon noticing Miss Marple, the inspector waved her over. "Perfect timing," he said. "Allow me to introduce Professor Hugh Lennox. He was one of Lionel Marsh's closest associates at King's College. Professor Lennox, this is Miss Marple." Professor Lennox inclined his head with polite reserve. "I'm sorry our acquaintance must commence under such sad circumstances, Miss Marple," he said quietly. "Lionel and I worked together on historical research, lost manuscripts, genealogical puzzles, that sort of thing.